Hi, glad you can join us here. In this brief video lecture, we're going to be going over how to prepare an executive summary. A lot of times these are used when we have very lengthy reports, and they're really meant to give a brief summary of that particular report. So over the course of this brief lecture, what we're going to cover is first, what is an executive summary? What is the purpose of an executive summary? Why do we actually use them and why do we need them? We'll discuss some of the different parts of an executive summary that you do want to include when writing them. We'll go over some different tips in terms of preparing these, and then lastly I'll give you an example just so you can see what one would look like. There's a lot of different ways that you can format executive summaries and how you can make them appear, and so I don't want you to necessarily be focused on that. I do want to give you at least some type of idea on what they can look like, although a lot of the presentation of it is up to that person's opinion. So I don't want you to necessarily just duplicate what I've done, but I do want you to have some idea on what to look for and what to include. So let's talk about what is an executive summary really. Really, it's a brief summary of a report. A lot of times when we write 5, 10, 15, 20-page reports for a number of different reasons when we're working, whether we're trying to provide our employer with some type of information so they can make a decision, a lot of times they don't want to read the full report. And that's really the purpose the executive summary serves. It's going to be designed for, instead of reading this entire report, I can get a snapshot of what it is that you've actually written. So executive summaries typically are no more than one page. For maybe lengthy reports, if you're including illustrations like graphs, tables, charts, those types of things, then obviously you may exceed that one-page limit, so to speak. But for majority of your writing, you're probably going to keep it to about a page. In terms of where they're located, you will typically put an executive summary after the table of contents, right? Table of contents being kind of that outline of exactly where to find what pieces of information, so to speak. So you want to include it after that and before you actually get to the body of what you're writing about. All right, let's go over some of the different purposes, some key things that you need to look for here. Obviously, we're trying to provide our readers with a summary of our work. A lot of times, the people that we were writing these reports for oftentimes do not have the time to read through the entire lengthy report. So they rely on the executive summary to basically summarize what that document says. And so there's a couple key things that you have to include. First is your executive summary should be a standalone document. It shouldn't be something that refers readers to other parts of the report. As you can see in example 7.1 on page 15. You shouldn't be referring your readers to other areas of the report for information. It should be a standalone document. So if I were to read your executive summary, I essentially can get the same thing as reading your full report. Now the full report obviously is going to go into additional detail, your methodology, how you collected the data, your recommendations specifically. There's going to be a lot more detail in the report. But in the executive summary, you're really giving everyone a kind of overhead view or bird's eye view of what it is that your report contains. One thing to keep in mind when writing executive summaries is a lot of times the people that read the executive summaries may not be necessarily involved in the actual field of study that you're writing about or have background in the field of study that you're writing about. And so you have to take that into account, right? Executive summaries, a lot of times when you do research, you can read through a brief executive summary to get an idea if that article is something that you want to read, is something that you can utilize. And so it's important that you don't use overly highly technical jargon or any special terminology to turn away your audience, because you have to understand that there's a difference between the type of person that reads an executive summary and the type of person that reads the full report. If you read the full report, typically it's something that interests you. It's something that is in your field of study that you have some experience in, right? Otherwise, why would you want to read 15, 20 pages of something that you didn't understand? But the executive summary is written by somebody who wants the knowledge, who wants to know what the findings are, but doesn't necessarily have the background to understand the specific minute details and technical jargon that the report may contain. So that's one thing to consider. is don't be overly technical in your actual executive summary. Now, you can get there, obviously, in your report. because your report is probably written for somebody who has a background in that. But in your executive summaries, you want to try to use general plain English. All right, next, what are the individual parts in an executive summary? What should you include when you're actually writing this? We'll go through a couple of these things so you get kind of an idea on what are the things you can include. Now, I will preface that by saying you do not have to include each of these things. A lot of times it won't even be feasible for you to include them, or won't be necessary because it's kind of assumed already, and I'll indicate what are those things. First, who asked for the report? Why are you writing this? Who is it geared towards? If you're writing a report for your boss and providing information regarding some policy or some procedure, then it may not be important to write who it's for, because they're the only person that's going to read it. It is for them. They asked for it. They're aware of it. You're obviously aware of it. And so you're not adding any value by mentioning who the report is for because of the fact that they asked for it. Now, if that report potentially can be published later on or available through a different area, then maybe it's important to indicate who it was for so they have some context in terms of how it was written. In that circumstance, maybe you would put who the report was for. Under normal circumstances, though, if somebody asks you, if your boss or supervisor asks you to produce something and to research something, wouldn't be completely necessary. You also want to look at what does the report look into. This is important because you want to provide your reader with a brief overview of what it is that you're trying to write about. What are you looking at? What are your, not necessarily your findings, but what is the executive summary, what is the report trying to answer, right? There's a purpose behind what it is that you're actually looking at, and you want to be very upfront and clear on what that is. Third, what is your bottom line? And this could be different depending on if you're maybe recommending something, if you're just drawing a conclusion, so to speak. That would be what your bottom line is. If you're trying to research, for example, the executive summary we're going to look at, the writer was asked to research whether or not terminating employees who failed to maintain a healthy lifestyle, so to speak, was something that they should pursue to reduce healthcare costs. So the bottom line would be the recommendation. I believe that we should go through this course of action, or I believe that this is not a good course of action. Whatever that is, you want to make your bottom line or make that point relatively soon in writing your executive summary. Remember that the people that are reading these aren't your typical reader. They are reading the executive summary because they don't have the time to spend diving through all the individual components and data that you've looked at to actually draw your conclusion. They want a brief overview of what that looks like. You may want to explain your methodology as well. If you've done any type of individual research, maybe you've administered quantitative surveys, if you've held focus groups, you want to explain how it is that you got that data. What was the method you used to conduct it, right? How did you determine you had an accurate sample size so that it was representative of the population? So you want to make sure and you draw those conclusions and you tell your reader what it is. This has to do with building credibility. So if your methodology isn't sound when you're conducting your research, then the conclusions that you draw may be discounted by the reader as well. Next, what are the most important things in the report? The executive summary we mentioned is roughly about a page long. So you have to prioritize. You can't include everything in the report, obviously. So you have to prioritize in terms of what is important. What do you want to include? If you could impress one or two things upon your reader in that short time they're going to read that executive summary, what would that be? What's your strongest argument if you're making a recommendation? Or what's your strongest argument if you're making a conclusion? What supports the conclusion the best? Those are the things you'll want to put in the executive summary. Obviously, you may have more things supporting your position, and you can include those obviously in the body of your text. If they want to read additional details, you can refer them to that. What's the structure of your report? Obviously providing with a brief overall structure on where things are located, so to speak. Many people think that this is kind of similar to a table of contents to an extent that it is, but there usually is a little bit more narrative explaining what that process is. And it's not specifically each individual thing, but it's kind of the main finer point, so to speak. All right, so a couple tips when preparing these types of things. One, make your point early. This is very important. Remember that the demographic or the type of reader that's looking at an executive summary is very, very sensitive of their time. They have time constraints, and they don't want to be reading things that don't have a point. So make sure you draw your conclusion fairly early. I'll show you an example of how this looks in an executive summary so you can kind of get a good picture in your mind on what to look for. Refrain from using jargon. I mentioned this before. We need to understand the difference between the reader that looks at our executive summaries and the person that would actually look at the report. So refrain from using technical jargon and those different, specialized terminology and things that you would only know if you had a background in that particular field. Using plain English. This is something that I've reiterated constantly throughout the course of this particular semester here. So always use plain English. It's much easier to read. People will like it. They'll continue to read, and maybe they will actually read the full report if it's written in a style that is fairly easy to comprehend. Use good layout. That's extremely important. The executive summary is essentially the first thing that your readers are going to look at when you're writing reports. So make sure that you start off on a good note. Obviously, if it has poor layout, it's not written very well, the likelihood that they would continue to read your full report diminishes substantially. So make sure that it's laid out fairly clearly, and once again, I'll show you an example on how to do that. Next, try to use illustrations, and I say if possible because sometimes it doesn't make sense to. But in the event that you have a lot of information, some data, you have graphs, tables, charts showing something specifically, it's always a good idea to provide that in your executive summary. Remember that if you can communicate information in a table, graph, or chart, it's much more effective than writing it out in a narrative form or in a bullet format. So you can communicate a lot in a very, very, very short time period. So it's very good if you can use those. Using illustrations is very, very effective. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to switch screens here. We're going to go over a brief example so I can show you what an executive summary looks like and how to prepare one. Okay, as you can see here, I have here a Word document open on my screen that is an example of an executive summary here. It's fairly basic, nothing too specific, but as you can see instantly, the layout is somewhat appealing, much easier to go through versus some of the conventional type writing that we've seen in the past here. So this executive summary specifically looks at, or was basically posed as a research assignment by an employer to find out if it's feasible to terminate employees because of being overweight or smoking because of the healthcare cost. If you've seen anything, there's a lot of talk about just the rising healthcare and how expensive it is, and a lot of employers are passing those costs onto employees just because it's getting so expensive to provide healthcare. So what are the things that we can do? Well, this employer looked at it from the stance of, well, if they don't lose weight or quit smoking, should we just terminate them? Which, if you look through the executive summary, we get the idea that that was not the recommendation that these people came across. They did not recommend terminating employees who failed to quit smoking. And you'll notice that they actually draw that conclusion in that first paragraph right here. So beginning here through here, you can see that they actually draw the conclusion that a more effective alternative exists to terminating employees who fail to quit smoking or lose weight. So they believe that that isn't the most effective thing to do. They make that point fairly early. Even before that, you notice that they explain what the report is for in this first sentence right here. In this report, we look at the link between employee health and their performance on the job. Okay? Specifically, should our organization terminate employees who fail to maintain a healthy lifestyle? Okay, so instantly the reader knows, okay, I know what this is about. I'm not necessarily looking at who it's for, right, because that's almost implied. Okay, it's written for the actual organization by someone within the organization or by an external firm. And then they state their point fairly early on. Okay, and now they break down what are the contents of that actual report, right? Okay, so we know what does the report look into. We know what the bottom line is now. Okay, we're going to look at, okay, they have recommendations here. So we see what their recommendation is right off the front. They want to offer incentives to participate in employee wellness programs. And they kind of explain some of the reasonings behind that and what they found. They go into their methodology, right? How specifically did they get the information to make this conclusion? Looks like they used academically or published academic research, quantitative surveys, focus groups, those types of things. And then they explain what are the things in the report? They explain the kind of the structure, so to speak. What are the things that we cover? Clarify the problem. We explain the methodology, how the data was gathered. The focus groups, we explain how those discussions were led, what kind of questions were asked, how do we determine who to include in the focus groups. And then lastly, we go over our recommendations, right? Specifically, what do we propose? And they also outline a specific path to implementation. Okay? So once again, this is just an example of what you can use in writing an executive summary. Not necessarily the same format, but you can see that I kept the same type of techniques we've been using. If you notice carefully, all of the headings that we use are actually in Arial, which would be a sans serif font, which we know is the best type of font to use for headings. I boldened all the headings. Use bulleted lists, obviously, because I'm presenting more than one of something in some areas. And then also use Times New Roman font for the body of it, because that is the traditional body type text, so to speak. And notice the spacing that I used as well. After spacings, or before, if you notice right here where after this particular paragraph, I have 2 spacings to 1 here, because I want to make sure that the reader understands that this area of text is associated with this particular heading, and plus it's a little more catching to the eye, so to speak. So I hope that helps in terms of providing you with a visual on how to look at executive summaries and what to include. Like I said, some of the stuff you don't necessarily have to include. You have to just judge it. It's a case-by-case basis. Does it add value for your particular report, so to speak? So once again, hopefully this was helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free and let me know, and I'll be happy to help. Thank you very much.